Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here to participate in your celebration of your 50th anniversary. Your bank has shown the contributions that a development bank can make to development. It's very interesting to see that your bank has had a higher credit rating than its member countries, and that means you are able to provide finance capital to invest in critical investment needs and infrastructure and other areas at a lower cost of capital than otherwise would have been possible. Let me spend a few minutes talking about the broader importance of development banks. 25 years ago, when I arrived at the World Bank, under the influence of neoliberalism, a set of ideas about markets being able to solve all problems, development banks were looked at with some skepticism. The irony was that even the World Bank took this view, even though the World Bank was itself a development bank. The general perspective was leave it to the market. Well, economic theory, even before that, had explained why you cannot always leave it to the market, had explained the limitations to the market. And since then, with the financial crisis of 2008, with the multiple financial crises in countries around the world, we now understand much better the limits of the market. Now, let me talk about a few of those limits. First, there's a need for industrial policy. Even the World Bank now recognizes that. In fact, under one of my successors as chief economist of the World Bank, Justin Lin, that was one of the major thrusts of the World Bank. Industrial policy addresses the large number of ever-present market failures, which is especially important when there has been too limited efforts to correct some of the market failures. The obvious example right now is climate change. The world is facing an existential threat with climate change, and there have been inadequate efforts around the world to deal with it, even though there's been a global agreement in Paris committing the world to address the issue. There's a recognition that the commitments made at Paris are not sufficient, and one has to incentivize, motivate, finance both the public and the private sector to take stronger action. And the provision of finance is particularly important, and that's where the development banks come in. A second example is developmental spillover. Even advanced countries now recognize that there can be important spillovers from one sector to another. The development of the internet, supported by the US government, has ushered in an era of technical change from which we've all benefited. We could not have been able to respond to the COVID-19 crisis in the way we have if there hadn't been those advances. Advances in researching science and biology have enabled us, again, to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, to develop vaccines, to therapeutics, again, supported by government research efforts, which have developed a vibrant biomedical sectors. It's not a question, as some people used to say, of picking winners, though government has done a very credible job of picking winners, far better than the private sector has often done. But it's identifying externalities and other market failures. And that's the function of development banks and industrial policy. A third area, which is absolutely essential, are distribution. The pandemic, COVID-19, has brought home very forcefully the inequities and inequalities in our society. This disease is not an equal opportunity disease. It goes after most virulently those who have pre-existing conditions, those who are most exposed because of the nature of their work. And these are overwhelmingly, disproportionately, those of lower income. It is one of the reasons why I think there is an outpouring in the United States for more action to deal with the injustices, the social injustices, including the racial injustices, have become so manifest. My own research showed the bias towards labor-saving capital investments, towards labor-saving innovations. These in turn lead to lower wages and higher unemployment. And these biases have been worsened by government policy in the post-crisis 2008 crisis world, with lower capital costs for large firms, higher capital costs for others. What we need recognize is both the level and the design of investments in a wide arena has been very badly distorted. So that lays out the problems in the development strategies and why government has an important role to play. But private finance is at the center of many of these market distortions. The private banking system, private financial system is short-term. The irony is that many of the investors are long-term, and many of the investment needs are long-term. But in between stand short-term financial markets. And again, this is precisely one of the key roles of development banks, to have a long-run perspective, taking into account the disparity between social and private returns. Even in developed countries like the United States, we are now recognizing the importance of development banks, of green banks. Here in New York, where I live, there's been established a Green Development Bank, which is playing a very important role in helping us respond to the challenges of climate change. The problem is not only that the private markets lend too little in certain areas, they often lend too much in others. They have incentives to get countries over-indebted. Worse, when the inevitable happens, there's a debt crisis, the private sector tries to strangle the countries in an irrational way, which is not only inhumane, but actually undermines their recovery, what they get. The creditors have opposed the development of a good, humane, and rational framework for debt restructuring. In 2015, the UN General Assembly adopted a set of principles, but a few of the major creditor countries, including the United States, refused. They believed that in the principle of the exertion of brute power, they were short-sighted in lending. They failed to do prudential oversight, and they are now short-sighted in their approaches that they take to restructuring. It used to be the case that the IMF acted as a creditor collection agency, but more recently, they no longer are doing that. They have undertaken a globally responsible role. They've said, making it very clear that debt restructurings need to be sustainable. In the past, the private sector debt restructurings typically were not sustainable. Within 5 years, half the countries that had restructurings were back into a crisis. So we now understand the principles of sustainability. We now understand what are the limits of debt restructuring, how it should be done. But unfortunately, the short side of the private sector is not going along. We are seeing this very vividly in the ongoing dispute with Argentina. Argentina, as it's approached the problem of debt restructuring, has played a very constructive role, working with the IMF, defining sustainabilities, developing models where one can assess that. And again, unfortunately, we're once again seeing the failure of the private sector. One has to ask, what is the reason that the private sector has been so inhumane, so flawed, not only in its lending, but in its restructuring? And there's a lot of debate about that. I think it's perhaps a reflection of the organizational failures. The individuals within the organization have a short-term perspective reflecting the short-term nature of the financial markets that I commented on a few minutes ago. What we see is that this kind of short-termism is being reflected in the debt negotiations with Argentina, with some of the creditors demanding money that is clearly beyond what is sustainable. I could put it very frankly, they're shameless. What is so ironic, some even pretend to be good corporate citizens, recognizing the importance of a long-term perspective. But while they talk the talk, they don't walk the walk. This then is a third fundamental way, besides correcting market failures and looking towards the long term, between development banks and private banks. The latter is based on exploitation, deriving as much profit as possible, the welfare of the country be damned. The former is based on positive values of cooperation and partnership in the way that CAF has demonstrated so well over the past half-century. Your bank has been a model for the entire world. Your success in this past 50 years has inspired efforts at creating development banks elsewhere. It has also inspired among academics research to understand why development banks can and do make such an important contribution. The 2008 and COVID-19 crises have made us more aware of the limitations of markets, more aware of the need for good public institutions and the need for regional and global cooperation. You are emblematic of success in that area, and out as a beacon in these troubled times. Thank you.
Mr. Stieglitz, thank you very much for attending this conference, for enlightening us with your words in these moments that Latin America is trying to rethink what is going to happen with not only the health or the education, but the economic standards. I want you to ask you just one question before we leave you. In Latin America, there is a huge infrastructure gap. We estimate that the region needs to invest around 6% of its annual GDP to address this gap. How can development banks such as CAF can help?
Oh, they're absolutely essential, because one of the problems in making those investments is access to resources. Another problem is access to the technology, to the expertise necessary to make sure that the investments are well designed, really meet the needs of the country and meet regional needs at the same time. And the development banks do both of those. They bring the expertise, which is absolutely essential. They also bring finance at a lower cost than the countries individually, or even the regions or municipalities would be able to do. So by bringing together both expertise, professionalism, and lower cost finance, they will enable Latin America to better meet these huge infrastructure needs that you just pointed out.
Mr. Stieglitz, thanks again for being here. Thanks for your time. Joseph E. Stiglitz, an American economist, you all know, with a Nobel Prize in Economy. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.